Hey everyone, so welcome to the Banh Chronicles podcast. I am your host, Randy Kim, and so I am going back into more of the emergency episodes that I was doing recently with the ICE raids, and I'm bringing on a familiar guest, returning guest, Francia Garcia Hernandez, who has been doing a lot of coverage on the ICE Chicago raids since Operation Midway Blitz happened last fall, and she serves as the journalist for Block Club Chicago, which does a lot of hyper-local news in the Chicago area, and she's been primarily working in I believe in like the southwest or southeast side, I believe, of Chicago, like the Pilsen, Little Village neighborhoods, which has a growing or has a very large Latino Hispanic population. And so thank you again for joining me this week. I know you've been very busy right now. So yeah, when you were on my show, you were reporting on the Operation Midway Blitz that ICE and Border Patrol were conducting in Chicago. And during that time, we saw tear gas is being thrown in neighborhoods, even in neighborhoods like Lakeview, which is predominantly very white. We have seen the attacks on a city council member or a Latino woman getting shot numerous of times while driving. We've seen tear gas violence being met against protesters and bystanders in random neighborhoods. And we've seen that against protesters outside of the Broadview ICE detention centers. And of course, the many forced arrest and detainment of many residents, including those who have U.S. citizenship status or legal status. So we are seeing now reports of ICE escalations happening again in Chicago, and the timestamp is June 24th, 12:05 p.m. And what have you been observing so far?
Yeah, thank you for having me. As you very well summarized, we had a lot of intense, very violent, very rowdy operations last fall, and that kind of went wound down at this end of last year, which leads many people to probably believe ICE is not as active or immigration agents are not as active in the Chicago area. What we've seen instead is a shift in enforcement, and it appears numbers are, significantly lower than they were last fall, where people were getting detained by Border Patrol, by ICE, and immigration agents throughout the city, seemingly at random, seemingly targeting Latino and neighbors who really don't look like definition of what Border Patrol consider to be Americans or U.S. citizens. Um, what we're seeing now is a shift in ICE tactics where immigration agents have been targeting local courthouses to arrest people who are showing up for a court appointment. This could be anything from a domestic violence hearing to a traffic ticket or a misdemeanor case or something along those lines. And they're getting arrested after attending their court hearing while arriving to the courthouse or before, So that's one of the tactics that we've seen. This, I have to say, has been widely condemned by local officials and advocates who worked really hard last year to pass a state law that bans immigration agents from making civil immigration arrests in courthouses. Um, these groups have been speaking out against that. Um,
Yeah, and has it been exclusive to just Chicago courthouses or has it been across Illinois?
It has been across Illinois. We've seen that in multiple Cook County courthouses in the Chicago area, and nearby. But we've also seen it in other counties, is what officials have said. Local rapid response groups also continue to report those arrests and other neighborhood arrests that continue to happen pretty much several times a week, if not daily. Uh, Throughout the city in the different neighborhoods.
Mhm.
It appeared for a while that some of these arrests were taking place in the northwest side of the city, in neighborhoods like Albany Park, where a few weeks ago we also saw a traffic incident where people raise alarms about violent tactics used by
Mhm.
immigration agents. But nevertheless, we're seeing reports from local rapid response groups throughout the city
Mhm.
of the tensions happening.
Yeah. What has the response from the courthouses been like from the judicial to the mayor's office and to Governor Pritzker?
That's a great question. So, my conversations with advocates and my reporting has found that the local sheriff is serving notices to
Mm,
immigration agents who try to enter courthouses, saying you're not allowed to be here for a civil immigration arrest and asking them to leave. It appears immigration agents are aware that they're not allowed to do so under state law. The Department of Homeland Security, however, disagrees, and they say, that um, federal officials have the ability to arrest anyone wherever they encounter them. And they're fighting in the courts. They've sued the state of Illinois for that lawsuit that
mm,
bans those arrests. Um, Beyond that, the law allows for someone who was detained at a courthouse in violation of that state law, if that's proven, to sue for
mm,
damages, starting at $10,000, and it could go up, depending on how they, say their
mm,
families or themselves were harmed by this unlawful arrest. We have not seen, however, anyone come forward and try to file a lawsuit in that case, so it is unclear whether that could be a successful case, but advocates and lawyers who were involved in passing this state law
mm,
have talked about this
mm,
being a possibility for enforcement.
mm,
Um, Last week, we reported, my colleague Mina Bloom and I reported that unfortunately, as immigration agents are targeting courthouses, some immigrant street vendors who appeared at a local courthouse in
mm,
Chicago for not having a license and being in Millennium Park selling goods without a license were then subject to arrest by immigration authorities. The response there from the mayor's office was that, the city is aware of what happened and they are working on an alternative or evaluating how people can attend these court hearings
mm,
um, over these type of violations while, not being subject to these arrests by immigration agents. We're still waiting to hear more about what that means and
mm.
what that could look like.
I wonder about CPD because we talked about Chicago police and its very murky line between cooperating with the feds, but also cooperating with the state and the city. What has their response been, and have they also made their presence in these courthouses when ICE has been present?
So for the arrest of street vendors who are also immigrants, what we heard from Chicago police is that they had, arrested these vendors or cited them or give them citations because the Chicago Police Department enforces all laws and regulations for the city. That's what we were told in the statement. We don't have more insight as to why there was suddenly an uptick in enforcement for street vendors. Um, the Chicago Police Department has routinely denied collaborating or violating sanctuary policies that, don't allow them to work with federal agents, and that has continued to be the case. Um, it has been up to the local sheriff's office to notify immigration agents appearing at courthouses that they're not allowed to be there under the way that the courts work, according to advocates. Um, I am not aware of any instances where Chicago police have shown up to a
Mhm,
courthouse to either assist or prevent or interfere with any sort of immigration arrest. I think that's different in some suburban counties where there have been concerns about that. But I am not as familiar with that specific case. But I know there were some concerns,
mhm, mhm,
and some news reports about that happening a few weeks ago, maybe
mhm.
last week.
And what can you say about those who have been detained recently in these courthouses and how many, what are the conditions that they are currently having to experience, while being detained so far?
Yes, so what we know, in the case of the street vendors who were detained, they were both Ecuadorian nationals. Um, it's our understanding that they had been here for about 3 years in Chicago and had been selling as street vendors for 3 years. One of them, a woman, was taken to a detention center in Kentucky, and her nephew, who was also detained, was taken to a detention center in Indiana, according to ICE records. As for other people who have been detained at courthouses, we followed the case of a Venezuelan immigrant. He's an asylum seeker. He had been in Chicago since 2023, filed for asylum, and had a pending case. He appeared at court for a misdemeanor over battery that he had been battling since, or appearing at court for since last summer.
Mhm.
And at one of the court hearings, he was detained, or after his court hearing, he was detained. He was transferred to a detention center, separated from his family. He has a wife and three children. And just last week, or in the last few weeks, he was deported to Venezuela. So he's no
Mhm.
longer in the country.
Mhm. And I know since the Chicago raids and what happened in Minneapolis and also in other places across the US, how has this changed the way residents and community and business leaders communicate with one another, specifically with Chicago, and what has changed as a result of these earlier raids, and how has that, impacted the relationship and the way, they respond to these emergencies?
That's an interesting question. I think for many, it depends on where you go, but for many immigrant communities in Chicago, they're still seeing the effects of Operation Midway Blitz, and they're still seeing the raids or like the enforcement actions taking place in their communities. So it leaves people with a sense of fear, a sense of anxiety. What I've heard from some local business owners is that, whenever there's a report of an ICE arrest in the neighborhood, usually if that's near their business, they'll see kind of like business plummet for that day or the next few days as people
Mhm.
are afraid of what could happen. Rapid response groups continue to be working and continue to be on alert and posting online announcements about where and when they're seeing detentions and when, those are recorded
Mhm.
and reported. Um, Beyond that, it's clear that many families are still suffering from the detention of a family member or the deportation of a family member. And there, are a number of concerns and real challenges that arise from that, from people being separated from a loved one, from parents being separated from their children and now having someone else take care of their child, mental health concerns and challenges, legal challenges as they try to seek attorneys to help them with those cases, financial challenges when people lost like their main provider, housing stability. It's just a number of things that we continue to see. And for many of these families, they had someone detained in October and they might not be able to bring them home yet. So that
Mhm.
operation is still very top of mind and
Mhm.
impacting their lives. So that's some of the things I continue to hear.
Mm. And also Broadview Ice Detention Center, what has been the epicenter of what has been going on with the raids, but also with the protests. What are you observing, or what have you been hearing about what's been going on at the Broadview Center and the protests that I'm sure is still very ongoing. Maybe not in the kind of numbers that happened during the peak, but what have we noticed so far from that particular hotspot?
Yes, Rabu continues to operate as a processing center, as we mentioned. ICE is still detaining people around the city, and most of them are transferred to Broadview first and then transferred to other detention centers around the country. As you mentioned, there were like much larger protests and much more violence happening during Midway Blitz outside the Broadview facility. That is not the case. The scale of that has significantly been reduced. But there are still people, who organize and protest in Broadview, and many of them did so for years before Midway Blitz happened. Um, Faith leaders also have fought for access to the Broadview facility, and they were granted that by a judge last May. So now they are able to visit the Broadview Detention Center and provide like faith services to people who are being held there. What we also know is there's an ongoing lawsuit that was filed during Midway Blitz when there were several reports that conditions in the center were inhumane, that many people were being detained there beyond the capacity of the center, that they had no access to lawyers, that they were not being given like proper meals or water or medical care, access to medicine, among other things. There was a lawsuit that was filed. That lawsuit is ongoing, and it appears that for now, conditions have improved according to some of the people familiar with that lawsuit. And there is a temporary restraining order that a judge had issued on that, asking federal authorities to comply with some of these minimum requirements, and that's still in place. So technically, federal authorities are still under the order to keep good conditions in the center. And what we know is it's not being used in the same capacity that it used to be during Midway Blitz.
Mhm. Yeah, with Christy Nome and Greg Bovino out of the picture in terms of what they were instrumental in creating with ICE and Border Patrol, what are we seeing in terms of indications? Because now that they have already been going in courthouses, have they also indicated any other plans to, be in other locations like at schools or any kind of strategic raids that they're also looking to enforce?
Yeah, well, DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, went under a leadership change earlier this year. So Kristi Noem and Bovino, the very familiar faces of the Operation Midway Blitz, are gone. We have new leaders at the Department of Homeland Security. It appears that one of the tactics or one of the priorities for the Trump administration is to target courthouses and immigration court as well. So that is the other type of arrest that we continue to hear and have been reporting on. People who show up for an appointment at immigration court or people who show up for a nice check-in and are then detained and then taken to detention centers, kicking off that process. That is something that continues to be like a priority for the administration. We recently reported on a very famous case here in Chicago of a Chicago public school student who was detained with his mother
Mhm.
after they showed up for an immigration appointment in the spring. They were released last month after almost 3 months of being detained. They're asylum seekers from Colombia, and they are now back in their Rogers Park home, but they have to continue to, pursue their asylum claims
Mhm.
and move on with that process. Those are the types of
Mhm.
arrests that seem to be also like a priority.
Mhm. And what has the response been from the Illinois Coalition of Immigrant Refugee Rights, otherwise known as ICER? I know that they have been doing their hotlines and they have been like speaking out very, very much against what has been happening with the ICE raids. What has their approach been to in terms of having to respond to this current current enforcements?
Well, what we have heard from past reporting from them is, the hotline continues to operate. ICER continues to provide know your rights information and refer families of someone detained to services that they might need and to other nonprofits that might be able to provide that help. And they've continued to condemn and speak out against some of the tactics used by immigration agents, including some of the arrests that were made without warrants during Operation Midway Blitz, which would have fallen under a consent decree that banned them from doing that. So they've been trying to continue to push for accountability over those arrests, along with other groups like the
Mhm.
National Immigrant Justice Center, the ACLU, and others. And as far as we know, rapid response groups are still coordinated by ICER, so that network continues to be in place for monitoring and alerting neighbors about ICE activity throughout
Mhm.
the city and putting that out in real time.
And what has been the recommendation of immigration advocates to community members in order to protect themselves? What tactics have they been, or what recommendations could they be providing to make sure that people do know their rights?
Yeah, I think the key one is people knowing their rights and understanding that. I think that can be spelled out in different ways. But one of the other key points that advocates have made is having like a family preparedness plan. So for immigrants who are at risk of being detained or fear they could be detained, to have all of their documents ready and have a plan that states very clearly with, legal authority, like who would be responsible for taking care of their children if they were to be detained, what would happen with their property and their assets and their money and bank accounts if they were to be detained.
Hmm.
And having like kind of like all of their documents and immigration information ready so that an attorney could take their case and have all that they need handy. That's part
Hmm.
of the measures that they've taken. I know advocates have also recommended that, if someone is due to appear in court, they could request a virtual hearing so they don't have to go in person,
Hmm.
and have been putting out information about how they can do that and shift from going to the court physically to appearing online. And the other continuous recommendation is to keep monitoring, keep recording immigration agents and reporting that to the hotline.
Mm. And as we start to wrap up, what are the things that you're currently working on, or what other things that you haven't been able to share so far that you would like to give light to in terms of what's been going on with ICE and Chicago's community response to it?
One of the stories that I have continued to follow, and I've done, several stories this year, is what happened to many of the people who were detained during Operation Midway Blitz, and what is the effect of their detentions in the
Mhm.
Chicago area, right? We know this impacts their families. We know this impacts possibly if they were employers, their employees, if they had businesses, that impacts them as well. But we also know that throughout the country, there are reports about inhumane conditions in detention centers, violations of due process, and other claims. So that's one of the stories that I've kept an eye out for, just like what
Mhm.
does that look like for many of the thousands of Chicagoans who were detained during Operation Midway Blitz? How has that upended or changed their
Mhm.
lives?
Mhm.
And the other part of that is like how have the Trump administration's policies made life harder or easier for immigrants in Chicago, whether they're asylum seekers going to court or whether they've been here for 30 years or they're DACA recipients? Like, what has made their lives more difficult or easier in the last year or so after experiencing Midway Blitz and seeing some of the national policies shift?
Mhm. And I also want to say, because I know that you are going to be heading off to other things right now, but like, I also want to say, thank you so much for being on my show and also like really giving a brief scope about what we are expecting, because I think a lot of people have this misconception that the ICE raids have been over, even though a lot of the pomp and circumstance, the uh, the spectacle nature of what was happening the last several months has died down. We have been seeing these upticks, and I think it's very important for viewers, listeners to really be able to understand what that has shifted into and how do community members, community leaders, and local elected officials are responding to this moment. So I really appreciate you shedding a lot of light into it. I hope that people follow the Block Club Chicago on their website, on their Instagram to get more like the continual updates, the day-by-day updates of what's been going on. Also want to shout out Unraveled for also doing a lot of the the labor in this work, and also Borderless has been doing a lot of great work in terms of being able to analyze and getting like the full big picture on it. So I really am glad that we are still having local journalists on the ground still being able to still inform community members. So thank you so much, Francia, for your time.
No, thank you for having me. And yes, definitely agree. We're lucky to have lots of local media outlets doing important work in Chicago. So thanks for having us.